The diplomatic shuttle touched down on Crosspoint 7 with barely a whisper. Jake Morrison pressed his face against the small window, watching the docking clamps lock into place. His stomach twisted with nerves. This was supposed to be the biggest moment in human history, and he wasn't even supposed to be here. 3 weeks ago, Jake had been filing reports in a basement office on Earth. He was a junior cultural attaché, which was a fancy way of saying he organized other people's schedules and made sure nobody forgot important meetings. Then someone in personnel had mixed up 2 files, and suddenly Jake Morrison was on the list instead of Jake Martinez, the actual expert who had studied alien cultures for 15 years. By the time anyone noticed the mistake, the horizon's edge was already halfway to the rendezvous point. Ambassador Claire Hudson had been furious, but there was nothing to be done. Jake was stuck on the most important diplomatic mission humanity had ever attempted, completely unprepared and terrified of making a mistake. The Valari Empire controlled 47 star systems. They had technology that made human science look like children playing with blocks. When they had sent their message requesting a meeting, every government on Earth had scrambled to respond. This was humanity's chance to join the galactic community, or possibly their last chance to avoid being wiped out by a civilization that saw them as primitive and dangerous. Jake followed the other diplomats through the airlock and into Crosspoint 7. The station was enormous, a neutral ground built by a dozen different species for moments exactly like this. The corridor they walked through had walls that shifted colors, responding to the emotions of whoever passed by. Jake watched the walls near him flicker between blue and anxious purple. Ambassador Hudson walked at the front of the group, her spine straight and her expression calm. Next to her was Lieutenant Paul Grant, who claimed to be a technical specialist but moved like a soldier. Behind them came the real experts, men and women who had spent years preparing for this day. Jake stayed at the back, trying to be invisible. The Valari were waiting in what the station guide called a ceremonial hall. Jake's breath caught when he saw them for the first time. They were tall, taller than any human, with skin that seemed to shimmer between silver and pale blue. Their faces were angular, with large eyes that had no visible pupils, just swirling colors like oil on water. They wore robes made of material that moved on its own, flowing and shifting, even though there was no wind. But the most striking thing was the silence. The Valari didn't speak out loud. They communicated through something they called the resonance, a kind of telepathy that let them share thoughts and emotions directly. Humans couldn't hear it, couldn't participate in it, and that fact made the Valari deeply uncomfortable. The ceremony began with a Valari noble stepping forward. A small device on his belt translated his resonance into words humans could hear. The voice was flat and emotionless, nothing like the elegant being who stood before them. "We welcome humanity to this place of meeting. Let us share in the ancient traditions of first contact." What followed was 3 hours of the most boring and stressful experience of Jake's life. There were rituals and presentations. The Valari nobles would make grand gestures, and Ambassador Hudson would respond with carefully rehearsed replies. Every movement had meaning. Every word had been approved by a committee. Jake stood with the other junior staff, trying not to fidget. His feet hurt. The formal clothes they'd given him were too tight around the collar. He kept thinking about the reports he'd read during the journey, all the ways this meeting could go wrong. Then he noticed her. She stood at the edge of the Valari group, separate from the others. While the Valari nobles moved in coordinated patterns, she stood still. While they watched the humans with expressions of polite interest, she looked almost sad. Her robes were different from the others, marked with silver threads that caught the light. She was clearly important, but the other Valari acted as if she wasn't there. When she moved slightly closer to the group, they shifted away. It was subtle, but Jake noticed. The ceremony finally ended, and everyone moved into a grand dining hall. Long tables had been set up, alternating Valari and human guests. Jake found his assigned seat near the end of one table, far from anyone important. The meal was supposed to be another diplomatic gesture. Human chefs had prepared small portions of Earth cuisine, carefully chosen to be inoffensive and impressive. The Valari had provided their own dishes, strange crystalline formations that dissolved on the tongue. Jake looked down at his plate. It held about 6 bites of food arranged in an artistic pattern. It looked like something from an expensive restaurant, the kind where you left hungry and pretended you weren't. He glanced up and saw the Valari woman again. She was standing near a wall, watching the dinner but not participating. No one had seated her. No one seemed to acknowledge she existed. Something about it bothered Jake. Maybe it was because he knew what it felt like to be the person who didn't belong. Maybe it was because he was tired of protocol and formality. Maybe it was just because she looked genuinely sad, and he'd spent the whole day watching people pretend to have emotions they didn't feel. Jake stood up. Lieutenant Grant shot him a warning look, but Jake ignored it. He picked up his plate and walked across the dining hall. The conversations around him died down. He could feel everyone watching. The Valari woman looked up as he approached, her eyes widening in surprise. Jake held out his plate. "Hi," he said. "You look like you could use some company. Want to share? This is way too fancy for me anyway." The entire hall went silent. Jake could hear Ambassador Hudson's sharp intake of breath from across the room. The Valari nobles had stopped moving entirely, frozen in what looked like shock. The woman stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, carefully, she reached out and took a small piece of food from his plate. "I am Kyria Vess," she said, her voice soft and musical, nothing like the translated resonance. She was speaking out loud, using her actual voice. "And you have just done something that no one has done in a very long time." "What's that?" Jake asked. "You treated me like a person," Kyria said. She gestured to the empty space beside her. "Please, sit with me." Jake sat down, very aware that every eye in the room was on them. He offered Kyria another piece of food. She took it and leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You're different," she said. The silence in the dining hall felt heavy enough to crush Jake. He sat beside Kyria, holding his plate between them like a peace offering, while dozens of eyes stared at them from every direction. The Valari nobles looked horrified. The human diplomats looked panicked. Only Kyria seemed calm, taking another small piece of food from Jake's plate with delicate fingers. Ambassador Hudson recovered first. She stood smoothly, her professional smile locked in place, and raised her glass. "A toast," she announced, her voice cutting through the tension. "To new friendships and unexpected connections." The other humans followed her lead, lifting their glasses. The Valari nobles hesitated, then slowly resumed their meals. The conversations restarted, but Jake could feel the stares continuing, could hear the whispered words, even if he couldn't understand the resonance that was surely flying back and forth. Kyria took a small bite of the food she'd taken. Her eyes closed for a moment. "This is good," she said quietly. "Simple, honest, not trying to be something it isn't." "It's just chicken," Jake said, then realized she probably had no idea what that meant. "It's from a bird on Earth. We eat a lot of it." "You share food with people you care about," Kyria said. It wasn't a question. "I studied human customs during my isolation. Food sharing is intimate for your species. Family meals, romantic dinners, breaking bread with friends." Jake felt his face grow warm. "I didn't mean anything weird by it, you just looked lonely." "I am lonely," Kyria said simply. "I have been lonely my entire life." She set down the food and turned to face him fully. "Do you know what the resonance is, Jake Morrison? Some kind of telepathy, right? You can share thoughts with each other." "More than thoughts, emotions, intentions, truth itself." Kyria's voice carried a weight of sadness. "When two Valari meet, they resonate. They feel each other's sincerity, their honesty, their very essence. It's how we know who to trust, how we form bonds, how we love." "Sounds intense," Jake said. "I cannot do it." Kyria touched her chest, right over where her heart would be if Valari anatomy was anything like human. "I was born wrong, broken. I can speak with my voice, but I cannot resonate. To my people, this means I cannot be trusted. How can you know someone's heart if you cannot feel it directly?" Jake looked at her, really looked at her. She sat with perfect posture, her robes arranged elegantly around her, but there was pain in those swirling eyes. "That's awful," he said. "You're not broken. You're just different." "My mother is the Empress," Kyria continued, as if she hadn't heard him. "I am her youngest daughter. I should be valuable, important. Instead, I am an embarrassment, a princess who cannot prove her own sincerity. They brought me to this meeting because protocol required it, but they expected me to stand in the shadows, to be seen but not acknowledged. Your own family does this to you? They do not understand any other way." Kyria picked up another piece of food, studying it carefully. "But then you walked across the room. You offered to share your meal. You didn't need to resonate with me first. You didn't need proof of my worth. You just decided I deserved kindness." Jake shifted uncomfortably. "Anyone would have done the same thing." "No," Kyria said firmly. "They wouldn't. No one has. Not in 23 cycles. Not since I was old enough to understand what I was missing." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "You're different, Jake Morrison. Your species is different. You trust without the resonance. You form bonds without telepathic proof. I have studied you, read everything I could find, and I wondered if it was true. If humans could really see value in someone like me." Before Jake could respond, a shadow fell over them. He looked up to find a tall Valari noble standing beside their impromptu table. The noble's robes were deep purple, marked with golden symbols that probably meant something important. "Princess Kyria," the noble said, the translator making his words sound cold and formal. "You dishonor yourself by sitting apart from your people, and you dishonor this human by forcing him into an uncomfortable position." "I dishonor no one, Lord Taven," Kyria replied, her voice steady. "Jake Morrison offered hospitality freely. I accepted freely. There is no dishonor in kindness." Lord Taven's eyes swirled with darker colors. "The human does not understand our ways. He cannot know that food sharing among our people is reserved for bonded pairs and family units. He has made a grave error, and you have allowed it to continue." Jake's stomach dropped. He thought about standing up, apologizing, trying to fix whatever damage he'd done. But then he felt Kyria's hand touch his arm gently, a brief contact that somehow steadied him. "Perhaps," Kyria said, still looking at Lord Taven, "the error is in assuming all species must follow Valari customs. Jake Morrison followed human customs. He saw someone alone and offered companionship. Is that not something to be respected rather than condemned?" Lord Taven stared at her for a long moment, then turned sharply and walked away. Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "I think I just made things worse for you," he said. "No," Kyria said. "You made things interesting. There is a difference." She stood gracefully, her robes settling around her. "I should return to my quarters before this becomes a larger incident, but Jake Morrison, I would like to speak with you again. Would that be acceptable?" "Yeah," Jake said, standing quickly. "I'd like that. I have about 1,000,000 questions." "As do I." Kyria glanced around the dining hall, where conversations had resumed, but many eyes still watched them. "There is a garden on the station's east wing, level 7, section 12. Tomorrow, at the midpoint of the station's cycle. No one goes there. It would be private." "I'll find it," Jake promised. Kyria nodded once, then walked away, her head held high despite the way the other Valari shifted away from her path. Jake watched her go, feeling like he'd just stepped into something much bigger than a simple act of kindness. Lieutenant Grant appeared at his elbow. "That was quite a performance," he said quietly. "Ambassador Hudson wants to see you in her quarters. Immediately." Jake followed Grant out of the dining hall, his mind racing. He'd come to this station as a mistake, a filing error, someone who didn't belong. And now he'd somehow befriended an alien princess who nobody wanted around. Maybe, he thought, that made them a perfect pair. Ambassador Hudson's quarters were twice the size of Jake's tiny cabin, with furniture that actually looked comfortable and a viewport that showed the stars instead of a blank wall. She stood with her back to the door when Jake entered, her hands clasped behind her back, staring out at the darkness of space. Lieutenant Grant closed the door behind them and took up a position beside it, his arms crossed. Jake stood in the middle of the room and waited. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Hudson finally asked, not turning around. "I shared my food with someone who looked lonely," Jake said. "You created a political incident." Hudson turned to face him. Her expression wasn't angry exactly, more tired than anything else. "Among the Valari, sharing food is an intimate act. It signals a deep connection. By offering your plate to Princess Kyria, you've essentially declared a bond with her in front of both delegations." "I didn't know that," Jake said. "Nobody told me." "You weren't supposed to need to know. You were supposed to stand quietly in the background and not interact with anyone important." Hudson moved to her desk and pulled up a holographic display. Images of Valari nobles appeared, along with dense text in multiple languages. "But what's done is done. Now we need to figure out how to manage it." "Manage it?" Jake frowned. "She's a person, not a problem to manage." "She's the daughter of the most powerful being in 47 star systems," Hudson shot back. "And according to our intelligence, she's considered defective by her own people, an outcast. By associating with her publicly, you've potentially insulted the entire Valari power structure." Lieutenant Grant spoke up from his position by the door. "Actually, Ambassador, there might be an angle here we haven't considered." Hudson looked at him sharply. "Explain." "The princess has been studying humanity. That's confirmed. She has access to our broadcasts, our literature, our cultural databases. She knows more about us than most of the Valari delegation." Grant stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "And she chose to engage with Jake. That wasn't random. She's testing something." "Testing what?" Jake asked. "Whether humans can be trusted without the resonance." Grant pulled up his own display showing intercepted Valari communications. Jake couldn't read the symbols, but he saw his own name highlighted in several places. "The Valari are here to evaluate us. They want to know if humanity can be integrated into their empire, or if we're a threat that needs to be contained." Jake's mouth went dry. "Contained? You mean destroyed?" "Let's not be dramatic," Hudson said, though her expression suggested Grant wasn't far off. "But yes, this meeting is as much an assessment as it is a negotiation. The Valari don't trust species they can't resonate with. They see our mental privacy as a threat. How can they know our true intentions if they can't read our thoughts?" "That's insane," Jake said. "We manage to trust each other on Earth just fine without telepathy." "Do we?" Grant asked quietly. "We have constant conflicts, betrayals, wars. Maybe from their perspective we look like chaos barely held together." Hudson waved a hand dismissively. "The point is, Jake, you've caught the attention of someone who might be sympathetic to humanity. Princess Kyria is an outsider in her own culture. She understands what it's like to be judged as untrustworthy through no fault of her own." "So you want me to keep talking to her," Jake said slowly. "Use her somehow." "I want you to be careful," Hudson corrected. "If she's reaching out to you, there's a reason. Find out what it is. But remember that she's still Valari royalty. She still has her own agenda." Jake thought about Kyria sitting alone at the banquet, the way the other Valari had avoided her like she carried a disease. He thought about the sadness in her voice when she'd said she'd been lonely her entire life. "What if she just wants a friend?" he asked. Hudson and Grant exchanged a look. "Then you might be the only human in history to make an alien friend before we've even established formal relations," Hudson said. "Which would be either incredibly valuable or incredibly dangerous, possibly both." She dismissed him shortly after, with instructions to attend the next day's meetings and to report back if Kyria tried to contact him again. Jake didn't mention that they'd already arranged to meet in the garden. Something told him Hudson would find a way to either stop it or turn it into some kind of staged diplomatic event. Jake made his way back through the station's corridors, following the color-coded guide strips toward the human quarters. He was so lost in thought that he almost didn't notice the figure waiting in the shadows near his door. "You're being followed," a voice said. Jake jumped, his heart racing. A man stepped out of the shadows, human, wearing the uniform of the Horizon's Edge crew. Jake recognized him as one of the engineers, though he couldn't remember the name. "What?" Jake managed. "Valari intelligence. There's one tracking you right now, staying about 50 meters back. They've been watching you since you left the ambassador's quarters." The engineer's expression was serious. "Lieutenant Grant wanted you to know. He says to act natural. Don't try to lose them. They're just gathering information." "Why are they following me?" "Because you talked to the princess. Because you've become interesting." The engineer glanced down the corridor. "The lieutenant also says to be careful tomorrow. The garden on level 7 isn't as private as the princess thinks. There are surveillance systems throughout the station." The engineer walked away before Jake could ask anything else, disappearing around a corner and leaving Jake standing alone in the corridor. He looked back the way he'd come but saw nothing. If there was a Valari agent following him, they were good at staying hidden. Jake entered his quarters and sat on his narrow bunk, his mind spinning. 2 days ago, his biggest worry had been whether he'd packed enough clean uniforms. Now he was caught between human intelligence operations and Valari surveillance, somehow connected to an alien princess who couldn't communicate with her own people. He pulled out his datapad and started reading everything he could find about Valari culture, their history, the resonance. Most of it he'd already skimmed during the journey here, but now he read more carefully, looking for details he'd missed. One passage caught his attention. It was from a human anthropologist's analysis of Valari society. The Valari bond through shared consciousness. Without the resonance, they cannot achieve the certainty of trust that forms the foundation of their relationships. This may explain their rigid social hierarchies and their difficulty accepting outsiders. They have never had to develop the skills humans use daily, reading body language, judging sincerity through actions over time, taking leaps of faith on incomplete information. Jake set down the pad. That was it, wasn't it? Humans had learned to trust the hard way through trial and error, through broken promises and kept ones. The Valari had never needed to. They had their resonance, their direct line to each other's thoughts and feelings. But Kyria didn't have that. She'd spent her whole life like a human, having to judge people by their actions instead of their thoughts. And maybe that's why she'd studied humanity so carefully. She was looking for others like her, people who understood what it meant to trust without certainty. Jake lay back on his bunk and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow he'd meet Kyria in the garden. Valari agents would probably watch. Human intelligence would want a full report. Everyone had an agenda. Everyone except maybe him and Kyria, two people who didn't quite fit in their own worlds, trying to figure out if understanding was possible across the vastness of space. He hoped it was, because if they couldn't make it work on a small scale, he didn't see how humanity and the Valari Empire ever would. The garden on level 7 was nothing like Jake expected. He'd imagined something with plants and flowers, maybe some trees. Instead, he found a circular room with a domed ceiling that displayed a perfect simulation of Earth's sky. Grass grew under his feet, real grass, imported from somewhere at incredible expense. In the center stood a fountain made of crystal that played music as water fell through it. Kyria was already there, sitting on a bench near the fountain. She wore simpler robes than yesterday, dark blue without all the silver threading. She looked up when Jake entered, and something that might have been relief crossed her face. "You came," she said. "Of course I came." Jake sat beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. "Though I should probably mention that we're being watched. Both our people have surveillance on this place." Kyria nodded, unsurprised. "I know. Privacy is a luxury neither of us can afford right now." She gestured at the simulated sky above them. "This garden was designed by humans, a gift when the station was built. My people find it strange. All this effort to recreate something you can see by simply looking out a window on your home planet." "We get homesick," Jake said, looking up at the familiar blue sky. "Sometimes you need a reminder of where you come from." "I wish I had such a place," Kyria said softly, "but I have never felt at home anywhere, so there is nothing to be sick for." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the musical fountain. Jake thought about all the questions he'd prepared, all the careful diplomatic inquiries Ambassador Hudson would have wanted him to make. Instead, he asked, what was it like growing up as a princess who couldn't resonate? Kyria looked at him, studying his face. Imagine being surrounded by people having conversations you cannot hear. They speak to each other with their minds, sharing jokes and secrets and feelings, and you only catch fragments when they remember to speak aloud. You are always outside the circle, always missing half of every interaction. That sounds incredibly lonely. It was. It is. Kyria turned back to the fountain. When I was young, I thought perhaps if I studied hard enough, learned enough, proved myself valuable enough, my people would accept me anyway. So I became an expert in alien cultures. I learned 17 languages. I studied history and art and science. None of it mattered. Without the resonance, I was still broken in their eyes. Jake felt a flash of anger on her behalf. You're not broken. They're the ones with the problem if they can't see how amazing you are. Kyria smiled, a small, sad expression. This is why I wanted to meet you, Jake Morrison. Humans say such things naturally. You judge people by their actions and their words, not by what you can feel in their minds. To you, I am not defective. I am simply different. Different isn't bad, Jake said. My mother would disagree. Kyria's voice hardened slightly. The Empress believes that humanity is a threat precisely because you are different. She has called this meeting not to welcome you, but to assess whether you must be controlled. Jake had suspected as much after his conversation with Hudson and Grant, but hearing it confirmed still sent a chill through him. Controlled how? The ultimatum will be delivered in 2 days, during the final assembly. Kyria spoke quietly, as if afraid the surveillance devices might somehow act on her words. Humanity will be given a choice. Accept Valari oversight, allow our observers into your governments and military, submit to our guidance, or be declared a rogue species. And if we're declared rogue? Economic isolation at minimum, possibly military blockade. The Empress has not decided how far she is willing to go, but she is afraid of your species. She believes that beings who can lie without detection are inherently dangerous. We don't all lie, Jake protested. But you can. That is enough for her. Kyria turned to face him fully. The resonance makes deception nearly impossible among my people. We have built our entire civilization on the foundation of shared truth. The idea of a species that maintains trust without that foundation terrifies the Empress and her advisors. They cannot understand how it works, so they assume it doesn't, that human society must be built on lies and manipulation. Jake ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. How do we prove we're trustworthy if they won't believe anything we say? I don't know, Kyria admitted. But I had to warn you. You showed me kindness when no one else would. You treated me like a person worth knowing. I owe you the truth, even if it costs me. Costs you what? I was not supposed to tell you about the ultimatum. The Empress planned it as a surprise, a way to pressure your delegation when they had no time to prepare. Kyria stood and walked to the fountain, trailing her fingers through the water. If she learns I told you, she will consider it treason. I will be exiled completely, sent away from Valari space forever. Jake stood as well, moving to stand beside her. Then why tell me? Because I have spent my entire life watching my people make decisions based on fear and certainty. They are so sure they know the truth through the resonance that they never question their assumptions. But I have learned to question. I have learned to look at evidence, to consider possibilities, to doubt. Kyria met his eyes. And everything I have learned about humanity suggests the Empress is wrong. You are not a threat. You are just different. There has to be a way to make them see that, Jake said. If there is, I have not found it. Kyria pulled her hand from the water and dried it on her robes. I have allies, others like me who cannot resonate or who question the Empress's policies, but we are few, and we have no voice in the decisions being made. The resonance strong make all the rules, and they cannot imagine a world beyond what they know. Jake thought about the banquet, about all those Valari nobles sharing their telepathic certainty while Kyria stood alone. He thought about his own world, where people learned to trust through shared experiences, through kept promises and consistent actions over time. What if we showed them, he said suddenly. Not told them, showed them. Demonstrated that trust without telepathy actually works. How? Kyria asked. They will not resonate with humans. They cannot. And without that, they will not believe any demonstration is real. Then we don't demonstrate it to them. We demonstrate it with them. Jake's mind was racing now, an idea forming. Your people who can't resonate, the ones the Empress considers unreliable, they're treated kind of like humans, right? Judged as untrustworthy just because they're different? Yes, Kyria said slowly. Where are you going with this? What if we brought everyone together? Not a formal diplomatic meeting with protocols and translators, but just people. Humans and Valari, the ones who don't fit the mold. Let them interact naturally, share stories, share food. Jake was gesturing now, excited despite the absurdity of what he was suggesting. If the Empress sees her own people connecting with humans, forming genuine bonds without the resonance, maybe she'll realize we're not so different after all. Kyria stared at him. That is possibly the most naive plan I have ever heard. But, Jake prompted, but it is also the only plan anyone has offered that treats both our peoples as equals rather than adversaries. Kyria's eyes swirled with colors Jake was beginning to recognize as hope. It would be difficult, dangerous. If it failed, we would both face severe consequences. And if it worked? If it worked, Kyria said softly, it might change everything. They stood together by the fountain, human and alien, both outcasts in their own ways, planning something that was either brilliant or completely insane. Above them, the simulated Earth sky slowly shifted toward sunset, painting the garden in shades of orange and gold. Jake hoped they had enough time to pull this off. The ultimatum was coming in 2 days, and they were planning to upend centuries of Valari certainty with nothing but good intentions and shared meals. But then again, stranger things had happened. He was proof of that. A filing error had brought him here. A simple act of kindness had connected him with an alien princess, and now they were planning what might be humanity's only chance at a real alliance. Sometimes, Jake thought, the universe had a weird sense of humor. Jake spent the next day convincing people that his plan wasn't completely crazy. It turned out to be harder than he expected. Ambassador Hudson listened to his proposal with her arms crossed and her expression growing darker by the minute. You want to bypass official diplomatic channels and host an unauthorized gathering with unvetted Valari citizens on a neutral station where we have limited security. Do I have that right? When you say it like that, it sounds bad, Jake admitted. It sounds like a disaster waiting to happen. Hudson stood and paced her quarters. Even if we could arrange it, what makes you think any Valari would attend? Princess Kyria might be sympathetic, but she's an outcast. She has no authority to bring others. She has contacts, Jake insisted. Other Valari who can't resonate or who've been pushed to the edges of their society. They're the ones who might actually understand what we're trying to do. Lieutenant Grant spoke up from where he'd been listening silently. Actually, Ambassador, there might be strategic value here. If the Empress is planning to deliver an ultimatum in 2 days, we have nothing to lose. Traditional diplomacy isn't working. The Valari have already made up their minds about us. So your solution is to make things worse by creating an incident? Hudson shot back. My solution is to change the conversation, Jake said. Right now, the Empress and her advisors are judging humanity based on theory. They've decided we're dangerous because they can't read our minds. But what if we show them actual humans interacting with actual Valari? Let them see that trust can exist without telepathy. Hudson stopped pacing. She looked at Jake for a long moment, her expression unreadable. You really think this could work? I think it's our only shot, Jake said honestly. The Empress isn't going to change her mind based on more speeches and formal presentations. But maybe, just maybe, if she sees her own people connecting with humans in a real way, it'll make her pause, make her reconsider. Hudson was quiet for another moment, then nodded slowly. All right, you have 24 hours to organize this. I'll make sure the station authorities don't shut you down immediately. But Jake, if this goes wrong, it's on you. Understood? Understood, Jake said, though his stomach twisted with anxiety. The next 18 hours were a blur. Kyria moved through the Valari sections of the station, quietly spreading word to those she trusted. Jake and several other human crew members worked to secure a common area, one of the large public spaces that wasn't controlled by either delegation. They arranged for food to be prepared, both human and Valari dishes, simple things meant for sharing rather than impressing. The hardest part was keeping it quiet enough that the Valari leadership wouldn't shut it down before it started, but public enough that people would actually show up. Jake sent carefully worded messages through the station's communication network, framing it as a cultural exchange, an informal gathering, nothing official or binding. He didn't sleep the night before. He kept thinking of all the ways it could fail, all the things he hadn't considered. What if nobody came? What if the Empress sent guards to arrest everyone? What if it just made things worse? But when he arrived at the common area an hour before the scheduled time, he found Kyria already there with 3 other Valari. They were setting up tables, arranging chairs in clusters rather than formal rows. They came, Jake said, relief flooding through him. A few, Kyria said. We will see if more arrive. She introduced the others, Valari, whose names Jake tried and failed to pronounce correctly. One was an elderly scholar who'd lost his ability to resonate after an illness. Another was a young engineer from a lower caste, whose resonance was considered too weak to matter. The third was a musician who'd been born, like Kyria, without the ability at all. Slowly, others began to arrive. Humans first, curious crew members from the horizon's edge who'd heard about the gathering and wanted to see what it was about. Then more Valari, coming in small groups, looking nervous but determined. Jake had arranged the food on long tables, buffet style. Simple things, bread and cheese from Earth, crystalline fruits from Valari worlds, dishes that didn't require explanations or special preparation. The idea was that people could serve themselves, could mingle naturally rather than being locked into assigned seats. For the first 30 minutes, it was awkward. Humans clustered on one side of the room, Valari on the other. People took food but didn't know what to say to each other. Jake moved through the crowd trying to facilitate conversations, but it felt forced and uncomfortable. Then the elderly Valari scholar, the one who'd lost his resonance, did something unexpected. He sat down at a table where 2 human engineers were eating and asked them a question in careful, accented English. I have studied your propulsion systems. Can you explain how you achieve such efficiency with your fuel consumption? The engineers looked surprised, then pleased. They started explaining, using hand gestures and rough diagrams drawn on napkins. The scholar listened intently, asking questions, offering observations from Valari technology. Within minutes, they were deep in conversation, the language barrier and species difference forgotten in their shared interest. It broke the ice. Others began to mix, finding tables, starting conversations. A Valari musician discovered that one of the human crew members played guitar, and they started comparing musical traditions. A young Valari who worked in agriculture bonded with a botanist over the challenges of growing food in space. Jake found himself standing back, watching it happen. It wasn't perfect. There were still awkward moments, misunderstandings, conversations that died out. But there was also laughter, genuine curiosity, people sharing stories and finding common ground. Kyria appeared beside him. It's working, she said quietly. Some of them, yeah, Jake agreed. But we need the Empress to see this. That was the whole point. She will see it, Kyria said. I made sure word reached her attendants. Whether she comes is another matter. They didn't have to wait long. The doors to the common area opened, and a wave of silence spread through the room. The Empress entered, flanked by guards and advisors. She was taller than the other Valari, her robes more elaborate, her bearing radiating authority. Everyone stood. The humans and Valari separated instinctively, moving back to their respective sides of the room. Jake's heart sank. All the progress they'd made gone in an instant, but then the elderly scholar, the one who'd started the first cross-species conversation, did something remarkable. He remained seated. He looked up at the Empress and spoke in the Valari language, his voice carrying through the sudden quiet. Kyria translated in a whisper. He says, "Your Majesty, I have been considered unreliable by our people for 15 cycles because I cannot resonate. But in this room, humans have listened to my words and valued my knowledge without needing telepathic proof. They have judged me by what I know and what I can contribute, not by what I cannot do. Is this not something worthy of consideration?" The Empress stared at the scholar. The room held its breath. Then Ambassador Hudson stepped forward. She didn't bow, didn't make any formal gesture. She simply spoke, her voice calm and clear. "Your Majesty, you fear us because you cannot read our minds. But perhaps that's not a weakness. Perhaps it's forced us to build something your people have forgotten. Trust earned through actions over time, through kept promises and consistent behavior, through choosing to believe in each other even when we don't have certainty." The Empress looked around the room, at the mixed groups of humans and Valari, at the shared tables and half-eaten meals. Her expression was impossible to read. "This gathering is unauthorized," she finally said, the translator making her words flat. "Yes," Hudson agreed, "it is, because official channels weren't working. Sometimes you have to break protocol to find truth." The Empress was silent for another long moment. Then she did something that shocked everyone in the room. She walked to the food table, selected a piece of human bread, and took a small bite. "I will not make my decision today," she said. "The ultimatum will be delayed. I will extend negotiations for another cycle. In that time, I will observe. I will consider. And perhaps," her eyes found Kyria across the room, "I will listen to voices I have not heard before." She left without another word, her guards and advisors scrambling to follow. The moment the doors closed behind her, the room erupted in excited conversation. Jake felt his knees go weak with relief. Kyria was beside him, and he felt her hand briefly touch his arm, a gesture of shared triumph. "We did it," he said. "We delayed it," Kyria corrected. "The real work begins now. We have to prove this wasn't just a moment, that genuine understanding is possible." "Then we'll prove it," Jake said. He looked around the room at humans and Valari starting to mix again, conversations resuming. "One meal at a time if we have to." Kyria smiled, the first truly happy expression Jake had seen on her face. "You shared your meal with a stranger, and you changed everything, Jake Morrison. You are different. And perhaps different is exactly what both our peoples needed."